Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Tryon from CircleCI. I am a community and partner engineer. I work to create some of the integrations on our CI platform. They're most notably known as Orbs, and we'll definitely get further into that. I have with me Ram from AWS, a solution architect. And today we're going to talk about serverless applications, testing those serverless applications, deploying those serverless applications, what that means and what CI/CD is. We're going to cover all the good stuff. And what I'm going to do is hand over the mic to Ram to tell you a little bit about the architectural side of serverless applications.
Thanks, Kyle. As Kyle mentioned, my name is Ram Dileepan. I'm one of the solutions architects here at AWS. I'm going to talk a little bit about the modern application development with serverless. I'm going to talk a little bit about the goal of this modern application development paradigm, and what are the components of it, including microservices, DevOps practices, and how did Amazon transform itself into this practice, and then talk a little bit about serverless and how CircleCI help serverless development or modern application development using serverless. As Kyle mentioned, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A icon in the bottom of your screen and submit the questions. We will try to answer as much as possible during the webinar. If not, we will actually come back to you. So having said that, let me move on. The main goal of the modern application development is to automate and abstract away as much as possible so businesses can actually focus on building applications to solve business problems rather than focusing on infrastructure and that kind of stuff. So we would like our customers to actually focus on building application to solve their business problem. That's one of the major goals. And the other thing is that we want to be able to help our customers able to innovate rapidly, because that's it's a requirement now. Everyone's came to expect that. The application development, adding new features, all those kind of things are kind of expected now. So we want our customers to be able to innovate very rapidly. So that leads us to this, the next slide, where we're going from monolithic application to microservices is one of these approaches which helps you actually innovate very fast and actually being able to deliver things very quickly. So if you look at I'm sure most of you have seen this before, but I just quickly go over the monolithic application versus microservices, and then how did Amazon transform ourselves into this, right? So the monolithic application, as the name sounds, is just one application does everything, but it's a shared release pipeline because it's just one application. The scaling is rigid because the whole application has to scale together, and the impact of change is very high because you are deploying the entire applications, millions of lines of source code. A change that you might think would impact only one component of that application might impact another. So things like that come into play. And then it's of course hard to adopt new technologies. One of the examples I always use is that let's say you started the application with the relational database in the back end, and now you want to be able to use a NoSQL database for some other purpose within the same application. Is hard to adapt when you have a monolithic application. So that's why we move into a microservices where each circle on this picture is actually a simple service. It's on its own. It does only one thing. Think about the examples like calculating shipment cost or calculating tax for sales tax and so forth, right? So these independent services, it does one thing and one thing very well, but they are deployed independently. And they actually come up with a contract that how they're going to behave, so the other services can consume them. As long as the contract is honored, they can independently deploy them and scale them independently. So you don't have to worry about scaling the entire monolith. The microservices then focus on scaling their part of it. That makes it much, much simpler to do. And the change is actually small. It has a small impact because it's only impact your services as long as you actually honor the contract. And the choice of technology also, it makes it very easier now because you can actually, each service can use its own technology which is best suited for that. And we are a big proponent of purpose-built technologies like purpose-built databases and so forth. So that actually moves our customers from kind of a traditional application development to modern application development at the microservices level. So the next slide actually shows you kind of how does it look like in the monolithic application development cycle? Because we are going to talk about mostly about development lifecycle in this, because that's where CircleCI help a lot. So I just put together this like to show that monolithic application development is a big application. Everyone contribute to it, and there's a development build, test, release cycle. Quite often, traditionally, it used to be like even yearly basis or semi-annual basis, quarterly basis. It's actually, you can already see that it's just not acceptable. We can't wait for a year to get features out because this was very complex to deploy this kind of application. So if you go to microservices development lifecycle, you could see that each development, each component or service has its own lifecycle, and some of the newer services which are just started up, just growing very quickly, have a faster life cycle, and something which is mature may have less of a life cycle. It doesn't matter because you can actually, as long as each so service 1 is service 2, as long as the service 2 has the services available, service 1 can release anytime they want. So that's a big benefit of going into microservices. One of the big benefits of microservices lifecycle architecture. Now, this is like a kind of a DevOps cultural philosophy. I just want to talk a little bit about it. It's just a mindset. You have to. It's just more than just word. There's a mindset, end-to-end ownership, and visibility and communication, right? This is kind of the high-level DevOps best practices, communication, collaboration, continuous integration, and continuous delivery, infrastructure as code. I'm going to get into some of it in the serverless perspective a little bit later, but at the high level, this is some of the things that we recommend. Now, how did Amazon transform? So we went from a monolithic application in 2001 into a microservices architecture in 2009. Completed the transformation. So it basically went from a monolithic application to microservices, and the two pizza teams, it's basically they're split into microservices. They're smaller teams, and they own everything. The two pizza team came up with the kind of the analogy for that. The team should be able to be fed by two pizzas. It's just a concept that we use within Amazon. So basically, we move from a big monolithic application to this kind of microservices-based architecture. And the advantage of that is that now in a year, we literally do tens of millions of deployments across all the environments. Just to give you an example, like in 2016, we deployed over 60 million deployments in 1 year. So you can understand the scale that this kind of transformation gives you, and how flexible you can be, and how rapid you can be in development, right? Now, the next thing comes is a serverless tidal wave, right? This is about serverless technology we introduced a few years ago, and now it's actually maturing and very widely adopted. So the question always, let me, before I go into that, what do we mean by serverless, right? This is a favorite quote from our CTO. The no server is easier to manage than no server at all. Right? Simple as that. So we basically want to manage all the infrastructure for you, so you can actually focus on just writing functions to solve your business problems. Don't have to worry about building, maintaining infrastructure, and so forth, right? What does it really mean? It means that no servers to provision or manage. And so I already mentioned about that, and scales with usage. So it scales up and down as you need, and pay for only what you use. So you don't have to worry about scaling up, scaling down, capacity in that sense, and also you don't have to worry about idling capacity, because the Lambda function is running, you pay for it. It's sitting there, you don't pay for it, right? That's the benefit that you get out of it also, and also the availability and fault tolerance built in. For instance, Lambda function run regionally, we can actually tolerate a availability zone failure. So you don't need to worry about a multi-AZ solution. It's all taken care of for you, right? Now, the biggest question that we are going to answer today is that when we talk about serverless, it's quite often asked that, can we follow the standard DevOps practices, development lifecycle that we use in traditional application development? So that's the question that we are trying to answer today. The straightforward answer is yes, we can, and we are going to talk most of the time on that. So before I hand this over to Kyle, I just wanted to also mention one more thing, which is, when you start modern application development with serverless or any other way that treat your infrastructure the way that you treat your code. Like infrastructure as a code always gives you benefit of being able to spin up infrastructure very quickly to test, deploy, all those kind of benefits, and you can actually track changes. So follow the DevOps practices with that as well. The second one is about the use in green, because that's what Kyle is going to take over, is set up an automated integration and deployment pipeline. And again, it can be done for serverless. We are going to do that. Now, the other thing I want to emphasize is that when you go into this kind of distributed architecture, build the monitoring and observability from the day one. It's not an afterthought. You really have to think about how am I going to monitor this component, because they interact with each other. If one component is not behaving the way you want it to behave, how do you identify that and resolve it quickly? So you really have to think about, when you design the application, where do you want to put the probes? What are you going to monitor? For instance, there are two components communicating with each other through a SQS queue. You want to monitor there's a message that's backing up on it. If there's a message which has a very long age in the queue, those kind of things. So you have to really start thinking about that from the day one. I really cannot emphasize that enough. Having said that, now I'll hand over to Kyle to take it from here and talk about CircleCI. Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you very much. Just give us 1/2 second here to switch screens. And here we are. So I believe y'all should be able to see my slide deck. So just to reiterate again, hello, my name is Kyle Tryon from CircleCI. And what we're going to take a look at today is how to actually build a serverless application using the serverless framework. And what we're going to do is show the full development cycle. We're going to go through we're going to gloss over coding such an application using the serverless framework. But then more importantly, how we're going to use CircleCI to continuously iterate on that, meaning we're going to run our tests against it. And then we're going to finally deploy that serverless application to AWS, again, using that serverless framework. So let's start off just by saying, actually, I'm sorry, excuse me for one moment, just to reiterate one more time, please feel free to post any questions below. There is a Q&A, and we will get to those at the end. All right. So let's just talk a little bit about who CircleCI is and what we do and what we're going to do for you in your serverless application. Here we are. So what we do is we are a CI platform, and we react to changes in your code. So if you are a user of GitHub or Bitbucket and you are pushing code up to that repository, CircleCI can get a notification on that and then execute some config against that code. And within that config, you can define many, many things which can happen, which we are going to go over today. So let's continue on and take a look at the pipeline. So when you push that code and something happens on CircleCI, that something happening, we call that a pipeline. And a pipeline can contain many components, as it may be. You will likely have at least one workflow. It's possible to have more than one. A workflow is a collection of jobs, and jobs are a collection of steps. We'll get into that in a moment, but a workflow is just a series of things we want to do to complete the task. So you may have a build, test, deploy workflow, or just a test workflow. In this example, we have 3. And what I'm going to do is click down into one of these workflows to show you what it's made up of and all the components that make up CircleCI. So again, we push some code. We see some pipeline kicks off. This is pipeline number 990 in this case, containing 3 workflows. Let's take a look at that service workflow. If we click into the service workflow, we will see, again, at the top, the workflow name. And within that workflow, which is really just a definition of a collection of jobs. Jobs, again, we'll go into a little bit deeper in just a moment, but jobs are a series of steps that work together, and these can work sequentially or they could work in parallel. It really depends on how you define it within your config. So you can see here, we have a testing job and a linting job. Those could very likely go together at the same time. We also have some deployments and some builds. You can imagine we're probably building first, then deploying, and we can actually take a look at the graph in this in a different view. Let's actually go one step further. So now we have this workflow, which is a collection of jobs. We understand that. What is a job? And this is where we're really going to get into the meat of everything. Here we are. So this is what happens when you click into a job, and we'll be able to see everything that's going on. This is where the action really takes place. So right now we're looking at a job called test Docker, and you can see at the top of the screen, this is actually from a project called Browser Tools Orb. We have lots of orbs. We'll go into that as well as the branch and the workflow that we're in. We go all the way down into the job. Here we are, test Docker. Test Docker occurs within an executor. In this case, the executor is the Docker medium resource class. The medium resource class comes with 2 CPUs and 4 gigs of RAM. And within every job, we have to run some set of steps. Those are the things that are actually taking place within this Docker executor. So this Docker executor in this case is certainly some variant of Linux, which is also defined within that config file. And when we define this job, we say that we want to run some set of steps that in this case would pertain to testing on Docker. So if you take a look here in this particular example, we can see a series of steps being ran, installing the JQ CLI or application, installing Firefox, Google Chrome, and all our web browsers. But we'll take a look at defining our own job in just a moment. One really interesting and helpful thing about jobs, especially when you're thinking about writing your config, each one of those jobs on CircleCI can report back to GitHub as a status check. So if you have, for instance, build, test, deploy, and build passes but test fails, then you could block a pull request on GitHub. And that's really one of the beautiful things about CI. You can ensure that you are not pushing any broken, insecure, or otherwise incomplete code. So let's actually take a look at the config and how we can orchestrate everything we just saw. And eventually we're going to get a little bit further into how we can use orbs to make this config writing easier. And then finally, we will get to deploying a serverless application using what we've learned. So here is a standard config file, as simple as it gets really, for testing a node application. At the top of our config, we're going to specify what version of CircleCI config we're going to be using. If you notice, by the way, this is a YAML document, if you're familiar. YAML is very similar to JSON, but more human readable for those who are not familiar. So we're going with the 2.1 configuration language. You can take a look at our docs for the full configuration reference. We're going to specify some jobs. In this case, we're only going to have one. We're going to name that the test job. The test job, as we mentioned before, has to have an executor. So we're specifying that we want to run on the Docker executor. On CircleCI, we have a lot of executors, not just Docker. You can go on Mac OS, Windows. You can use a Linux VM as well. But in this case, we're going to be using Docker and pointing it at one of our convenience images, which are just highly optimized, efficient images that you can run on CircleCI. So now we have that. The resource class is medium by default, so we didn't specify it. And then we're going to specify our steps. So what do we want to do on CircleCI to test our node application? Well, first thing we're going to do is check out the source code. Then we're going to restore any cache that we may have saved. That will just make it faster to install our NPM packages. Speaking of, the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and install those NPM packages. And finally, assuming that this is the first time or we've downloaded something new, we're going to go ahead and resave that cache, make sure that we can pick it up on the next run. Finally, we're going to run npm run test, as this is not a Yarn application in this particular instance. And that is our job defined. Now we just need to invoke it in some way. We do that in the workflows area. In the workflow, we're going to specify one workflow called test my app. This is similar to what we were looking at a moment ago with one called service. Within that workflow, we're going to list any jobs that are going to run. In this case, I only have one, and it's called test. I have no further filters or anything else that's going to interfere. So the way this config is written right now, every single time I push code to my repository, no matter the branch, this workflow here called test my app is going to fire, which is in turn going to fire off the test job. Now, we've done this in 24 lines of config. And as you can imagine, if you were to have lots of Node projects, maybe you have multiple microservices that are written in Node, you're probably going to need to do something like this very often. It's not going to differ much between your different Node projects. You'll generally check out your code, save the cache, hit npm run test, and so on. So we can actually use orbs to make this process a lot more painless, and we can distribute it across multiple projects. So when you want to use an orb, and we'll get a little bit deeper, you can first head over to the Orb Registry to see what kind of orbs we have. And these are these integrations, these small packaged pieces of config that are going to make those longer processes much shorter for us. So if we look here, currently our most popular orb is Node, so that's the one we're going to be taking a look at today. If you were to search in here, you will also find the serverless framework, another orb we're going to be taking a look at today, as well as many other technologies, of course, all of the AWS things that we can put in here, S3, so on and so forth. If you click into the node Orb, you will get all the documentation about it, all of the components that it provides to your config. So Orbs can provide many things. We were looking at a job a moment ago, and that's what we're going to utilize, but feel free to take a look at the page and see what else we offer. So the first thing you'll notice is we have some usage examples, and we'll take a look at those on the next slide. As far as components go for our config, this offers a job called test, which again, we're going to take a look at in a moment, as well as some commands. So we saw earlier there were some steps for installing browsers and so on and so forth, but we can actually define those within Orbs as well. So we have like an install command to install Node.js itself if need be, a command to install the npm package manager, the yarn package manager, and the install packages command, which actually does all of the cache saving for you. So it's very nice. Let's take a look at those usage examples. So rather than writing all of that config, the 24 lines we were talking about earlier, we can actually do just this using the node Orb, and it does exactly the same thing and then some actually. So let's take another look at the config. At first thing, I'm going to actually skip over the first 2 lines for just a moment to point out that we are again using version 2.1. And then notably here, let's go back up to the top. We are importing Orbs. That is our package manager for CircleCI config. And it works pretty similar to another package manager you may have used, like NPM is a good example. So there is an Orb that lives at the namespace CircleCI with the name node, and you can specify which version that you wish to include. Here, we're just putting XY as an example. And we're going to import that under this name, like a variable, you can think node. Notice I don't have any jobs because I don't need to. In this particular instance, the Orb is going to provide the job that I need, so I don't need to define it. I'm just going to go straight into workflows, and I'm going to call this workflow matrix test. You may already get ahead of me and see where I'm going with this, but we'll explain in a moment. The matrix test workflow has a list of jobs, only one, and it is, the node test job. And this is actually just something that we can do on CircleCI that's a little bit extra. And I figured we had more lines. You could stop right here, 7 lines, and we did everything. But let's go one step further. The node Orb actually will, any Orb really, will accept parameters. One of those parameters for this job being the version of Node.js you want to use. So we can actually run what's called a matrix test and run 3 jobs in this instance for each version of the parameter that we supply. So there is a parameter named version. I want to use the version parameter 13.11.0, but I also want to use 12.16.0 and 10.19.0. So on CircleCI, this is actually going to run this job 3 times on different versions of Node. So we were able to do all of that in just 13 lines instead of 24. Again, if you want to take a look at what parameters are available, you can go into the Orb Registry and take a deeper dive at that documentation. We were just taking a look at that version parameter, which specifies the node version, but we also have the package manager parameter, and that right now is set to NPM. If you're a Yarn person, you can change that to Yarn. So you can see how these Orbs are going to be really helpful for getting you started really, really quickly, or doing complex tasks across multiple projects. So let's actually talk about a real project using a serverless API that will be deployed to AWS, tested on CircleCI. It's much easier than it sounds. So the first thing I want to take a look at, we already took a look at the node Orb, which is very integral to this process, but we also want to take a look at the serverless framework Orb, which is going to be very helpful in getting us started. What this really is going to do for us, for the most part, is install the serverless framework into our environment. So if you can imagine you're using a Linux Docker image, which does not have the serverless framework installed, this will be very, very easy for you to get that CLI added to that environment. It also does some other things under the hood, such as providing very helpful error messages if you, for instance, forget to add your credentials or anything like that. And for the project that we are going to be demoing, and we'll do a live demo in just a moment, you can find the source code at the GitHub link provided. This is exactly what we're going to be launching. Everything is open source, everything is public, so feel free to follow along. To get started, if you want to follow along, go ahead and clone that repository to your GitHub account. And the next thing you're going to have to do, if you are not already a member of CircleCI, is authenticate with CircleCI. You'll click the sign up button. It will authenticate against GitHub. There is no username and password. You just sign in with SSO. And we're going to need to set up some environment variables before we get started. We'll show that right here. So after you are authenticated, you're going to see a screen that looks just like this one. You're going to see a list of repositories in your account. If you don't see the project that you were looking for, you can go ahead and use the search box, especially if you have a long list of projects. So we can see here, we actually have, this is looking at the CircleCI public repository, and I'm just searching serverless. We have this demo project. You can see I'm already following 2 other projects. That's the serverless framework Orb, which we were building. And another method of serverless application is AWS SAM serverless, which we're not going to go over today. Before we set up our serverless framework demo project, because this project already has a CircleCI config that is set up for us, we need to add our AWS environment variables so that we can deploy to AWS without hitting any kind of failure. The way we're going to do that is through a feature on CircleCI called contexts. And contexts are like a bucket of environment variables. So you can say, here is my context, and it contains 5, 6, 7 environment variables, and then you can attach that to multiple projects. So we're going to create that first, attach it to this project, and then we'll be set. So the first thing I need you to do to get that started is click on your org settings button right here. It looks like a gear icon on the left side of your screen. And you will see the context window first. If you have any context, you'll see them in there. Of course, in this particular example, we're assuming you will not. So go ahead and click Create Context and give it whatever name you like. Something like AWS Deploy or anything like that would be fine. And you're going to add any necessary environment variables. Now, it depends on where you're deploying to. In this example, of course, we're using AWS. We're going to need our access key, the default region, the secret access key. And here you can see that we are also demoing the serverless framework Orb using the premium version of serverless.com. We're actually not going to take a look at that dashboard in this particular webinar, but we may in additional webinars. One thing you will need to update is in the configuration file that comes with this demo project. Everything is written for you, and we are going to take a deeper look at it together. But whatever you have named your context, you will need to update the config as well. So at the bottom, you will see there is the context value. Right now, it has a value, something to do with the orb. Just change that to whatever name you gave your context. All right, once you have set up your environment variables, we're ready to deploy to AWS. You can take the demo project and run with it, and we will do that live. Go ahead and press Setup Project. You're gonna see a window like this one. By default, CircleCI is going to ask if you would like us to commit a sample config for you. We don't need to do that. Ours is built for us, so we're gonna go ahead and press the Add Manually button. That'll bring us to this window, and we can just go ahead and press Start Building because we have everything we need. Now, let's go on to the live demonstration. Let me hop out of here. And let's take a look at, here we go. So here is the GitHub that we were talking about previously. This is our serverless application. So what we're going to do is take a brief look at this just to see what it does, and then we're going to build, test, and deploy it. I have this already open in VS Code. And what I want to show you is just real quick so that everyone has an understanding of what our end result is going to be. With the serverless framework, what we are doing is we are coding these functions, which we're going to deploy to AWS Lambda so that when we access some API endpoint, it will run that function for us. In this case, it's actually really, really simple. We have one function called add numbers, and all it's doing is using a reduce to take an array of numbers. So you can pass this API an array of numbers, and it will add them all together and give you back the result. So you can see we have module.exports.add. We also have .hello just to make sure everything's working. And this will export our add function, which actually goes into our serverless.yaml file, which specifies the API that we are setting up on AWS. So we can post to /add. It will expect that array of numbers, and then it's just going to give us back the added product of our numbers. So how do we test it? How do we deploy it to AWS? That's what we're going to go over next. First thing to note is this is still a Node application. So if you were familiar with Node, we can still test it using things like Jest. So we can actually take a look at our spec right here. And we understand that if we pass in some data, which I have here, for instance, we're going to add up the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In our specification, we understand that we are expecting a result of 15. This is just standard Node.js testing. Now that tests our function locally. We can also test it on AWS, and then we're going to use serverless to deploy it. So let's actually just push this up to CircleCI with the config that we have and see what happens. And then we'll also take a look at the config. So before we do that, I need to actually make some kind of change to this file so that we have something to push up to GitHub. So what I'm going to do is go into the config, and we're going to take a deeper look at this in just one moment. But in the test job, I'm going to run name echo me. Okay, it doesn't want to. There we go. Command echo hello. I'm just doing that to trigger some change that will actually push it up to GitHub. So we'll push this. And let's go see what's happening on circleci.com. Okay, so it's already started. You can see on CircleCI, if you take a look at the dashboard for the serverless framework demo that we are looking at, and by the way, because this is open source, if you were signed in to circleci.com, you can actually view this page right now that I am looking at. We can see that there are two jobs here. We have a test job and a deploy job. Deploy is stating that it is blocked at the moment, and that is because we have told it to wait until success completes. And we're gonna go take a look at what happened there. And let's come back to this deployment as well. We're going to allow that to finish while we take a look at the config, figure out what's actually happening behind the scenes, and then we'll revisit it. So let's take a look at our config. Our total config with comments and spacing and everything is 49 lines, but I believe we can actually make this a little bit shorter if we want it to be less verbose. At the top of our config, we're importing 3 orbs. We have the serverless framework orb, which we expect, the AWS CLI orb, not strictly necessary for this particular project, but it actually makes it a little bit easier for us because it's going to run our, it's going to generate for us our credentials file. So it's easier to use it with the CLI than without. And of course, we're going to use the node orb. We have 2 jobs here. We have a test job and a deploy job. And before we look at that, let's take a look at our workflow. We see that we have a workflow named test and deploy. It has 2 jobs in it, test, which has no filters of any kind, and then deploy, which is stating that it requires test. So deploy, as we saw, was blocked as it was waiting for test to complete. And we're saying that we only want to run the deploy job if we happen to be committing to the master branch, which in this particular instance we are. We are also attaching a context to this particular job in this workflow, which just states that it's going to inject those environment variables for us when this job runs. All right, let's take another look at the config before we hop back over. So in the test job, we are using an executor that was provided by the node executor. This defaults to 13.11.0. Again, that version parameter is there, so you could use that. We're gonna run some steps. We're gonna check out our code. We're gonna install our packages. We just did our echo hello and npm run test. If you noticed, we could have just used the node test job, just showing off how we can do this manually. This is going to run those jest tests, and assuming that passes, we're going to go on to the deploy job. Let's take a look at what's happening here. We're going to check out our code again. We're going to set up the AWS CLI, which is going to set up that credentials file for us. We're going to install those node packages again. And finally, we're moving on to the serverless orb. So with the serverless orb, we have a setup command very, very similar to AWS CLI that's going to install the CLI, authenticate with it if you're a premium member, and make it available for use on the CLI on the terminal. We're also providing some additional parameters. Again, this is the provider is actually something we have implemented, which just provides nicer error messages. For instance, if you were to use serverless setup provider AWS, but not have ran AWS CLI or didn't have your credentials ready, then this would not run. Once we set app name and org name, that's something that is available in the premium version of serverless.com in their CLI. We're just using the open source version really for this particular test. Next thing we're going to do is actually an additional form of testing. This is kind of optional, just something I wanted to show off that we could do. You could have also put this in the test job. Of course, we could have also had a test and deploy job in all one definition, totally up to you. Serverless actually comes with, this is the serverless API, comes with a local invoke ability. So what we're able to do is actually locally invoke our add function and pass it that sample data. Very similar to what we did with the jest tests, but it's actually using the emulation of the Lambda service. Assuming that passes, we're going to go on to finally use the serverless deploy. Since we installed the CLI earlier with the orb and that setup command, we can actually just run the command serverless deploy. We'll make it verbose just so that we can see what's happening. All right, so everything makes sense. We understand what's happening in the config. Let's go back and good, everything is green. That's exactly what we wanted. Now in this particular demo, we didn't do anything with pull requests or blocking anything. We didn't make anything fail. So let's just take a look at the result and then we'll actually hit that API and see that it's working on AWS. So I'm gonna open up both of these jobs in new tabs. We'll take a look at test first. So this is the result of everything we wrote in that config. As we can see, we're on the test job, Docker Medium. If we go into spin up environment, I can actually see that we're using that CImage node. This is that default node executor that we were using. And then we can go down and see everything that we expect. Here we're checking out our code, we're restoring the cache. We can click into these and get a little bit more detailed information. The cache here was already up to date, so we didn't need to save it again. Install those node modules. We did the echo so that we could trigger the change. And finally, we're gonna run our tests with Jest. And of course, as we expected, that has passed, and that is why the deploy job triggered. So let's take a look here. Everything that we expect again, check out our code, AWS CLI is being installed, configuring our credentials for us, caching our node modules, going through, installing the serverless CLI. Here we go, we're actually locally invoking it. So we can take a look here. We're gonna add the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the result was 15. In this case, we're again using the premium, the enterprise version of serverless, so that was included as well. And finally, we're running serverless deploy, which will get our function up to AWS Lambda, so we can see that this has run successfully. Fantastic. So let's actually use that API. We know it's live now. I have the URL actually loaded into a API testing. It's very similar to Postman, if anyone's familiar. I'm opting to use Insomnia, but same concept. So I'm passing it through the object that it's expecting. It is a object with the numbers key, and I'm passing it the numbers 1, 2, 3. So let's go ahead and send that off. And we have our result of 6. That is effectively one microservice of what could be a monolithic application, built very, very quickly, easily tested, and now we can make those iterative changes before deploying them off to AWS. Again, all that source code is completely available. You can even see the results that are running on CircleCI. All the orbs themselves are open source, and feel free to fork, modify anything you need to do there. If there are any questions, again, please, the Q&A is at the bottom, and we are happy to answer any questions that we can. As far as the demo goes, that is everything. I will bring us back to our page here and allow the questions to come in. In the meantime, I don't know if Ram, did you want to add anything from the AWS side?
No, thanks, Kyle. It was a good demo. It was very clear as to what we need to do. Thanks again. And I don't think there's any questions. So I think we can close the webinar.
No questions is a good sign.
Yeah.
Hopefully it means everything was explained well. Hold on, I do see there's one chat. Let me grab that. What is that? Can we get the recordings? Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry. So some of the questions went to the chat. Let me just answer those real quick. Can we get the recordings? We should absolutely be able to do that. We have the list of attendees. So let's, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say if we can send it out to everyone. I'm assuming we can. So let's say yes, we'll send those out, make sure of that. End-to-end testing. Yeah, so actually we can do that. I wasn't prepared with the demo, but I'm actually, let me show you a little off screen here, but remember I mentioned, so first of all, there's a lot of ways to do serverless. Serverless is not one defined thing. In this particular demo, we were using the serverless framework. What I'm about to show you can be done exactly the same way as the serverless framework. But what I'm going to show you is something that we set up with the SAM serverless orb, which is another way to build serverless applications on AWS. And we actually do have an end-to-end testing example in there. So let me go back to the Orb Registry. And take a look at our results for serverless. And I'm going to go down to AWS SAM serverless for this particular example. And here we go with our build, test, deploy example. Let me make my screen a little bigger. Okay, so this is pretty similar. This example is shown a little differently, and the way that you build the application is a little different, but this is still a serverless application. It's still a Lambda function, and it's still being deployed to AWS. It's just using a different framework. So in this particular example, what we are doing, and again, you can do this exactly the same with the serverless framework, is in this particular workflow, test and deploy, we're doing a different type of testing. We're actually not even doing the local jest testing as we showed. What we're going to do is deploy, we're using the SAM deploy job in this particular instance, our application to a particular stack. In this instance, it's the staging stack. And then we're going to run a separate job called test my API, which is requiring that the staging stack has been deployed. And then assuming that test my API has completed, we're going to go ahead and deploy that same code again using the exact same job, except in this instance, we're changing that parameter of stack name to production stack, which is where we anticipate that our final code would live. Now you can imagine this particular instance, test my API is just an example job, but you could test against whatever that application is that you have launched. You can test against it by putting it in some particular staging stack or test environment, dev environment, whatever that is, deploying that through CircleCI, running your test against that, and then, of course, deploying to your final destination.
If I may add one more thing to that, Kyle. Yeah, so one of the benefits of serverless is that you can actually build, deploy, and test, like as Kyle said. If you had to do that in a traditional environment, you need an environment specifically for that. So this is one of the things we strongly recommend is that yes, we do local testing, as Kyle mentioned, but we also recommend that you actually deploy and test every time when you when you have significant changes to it, because that way that you can actually see how well it behaves, right? And it meets all the requirements. So there's a very important point that Kyle brought up. So that's actually one of the major advantages of having serverless application. Then there was another question about managing IAM credentials. Of course, you had to follow the standard IAM best practices, but also what we recommend is that when you create Lambda functions, create roles associated with them. So each Lambda function has its own role, so you don't have any permission bloating and things like that. How does IAM credentials are managed within CircleCI? As you could see, it was actually encrypted and stored. I think I'll let Kyle talk. I'm not an expert in that, but
yeah, I'll give you the actual technical. I believe I can share it. Either way, I'm sharing it. On the back end, we actually use HashiCorp Vault. That's how contexts work. So what happens is when you create that context on CircleCI, you're creating that bucket with those environment variables. Now, if you want to also go a step further, you can use, for instance, like credential management systems such as AWS Parameter Stores is one option. We actually have an orb for that. Secret Hub is a very cool orb that we have for things like that. So if you want to use a secret management solution, that's absolutely an option. One of the most native ways on CircleCI right now is through those contexts. But if you're looking for those additional features, something like one-off keys, you may need to work with an integration that supports that. And I did see, I think, a raised hand. If you did raise your hand, feel free to type out the question, and we'll definitely get to that. And these two will mark as answered. All right, I'm gonna give it just one more minute, see if any more questions come through. While we're waiting, I just wanna say to everyone, thank you for joining us. I hope we were able to answer a lot of your questions. I know for me personally in the past, it was kind of a question of whether or not it was even technically possible to test serverless applications in the same way as traditional applications. I really think that we've found, first of all, yes, you can do that. And not only can you, there's actually a lot of different ways that you can come across it. As everyone mentioned here, you can do the local testing. We can actually locally invoke an emulation of our deployment environment using SAM serverless has a local invoke that actually uses Docker. The serverless framework itself, I'm not actually sure how that one works, but it will also emulate your code locally. And then of course we can do our real end-to-end testing. All right. Thank you for the thanks in the chat. I think we're good with questions. One last time I'll throw out there, we'll have the links to everything available. I'll actually make sure that we send these out with the recordings. If you want to take a look at the source code, if you want to take a look at the config file, I highly recommend taking a look at this serverless framework demo on the CircleCI-public GitHub page. I'll actually throw that in the chat before we leave as well, just in case. All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and end the stream. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.